Hello and welcome to Human Bridges in the Study of Race, Religion, Art, and Politics. This is a socialized remotely signature event brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning and socializeremotely.harvard.edu. Today's event continues the conversation from our recent HILT conference on championing equitable instruction and inclusive classrooms. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. All participants will stay muted for the duration of the event. We ask that you chat only to contact us about technical issues. Instead, to submit a question to our panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. You can submit your questions there, and you can view and upvote questions from other participants. This event is also being live streamed on YouTube, and we'd like to welcome the many members of Harvard's alumni community joining us by YouTube today. If you're watching the YouTube stream, we do have a moderator present to assist with any technical difficulties and to feed us any questions you may have for our panelists. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Today's event is titled Human Bridges in the Study of Race, Religion, Art, and Politics. This talk will explore teaching about difference in a Divinity School course that looks at connections between the Harlem Renaissance and Mexican Modernism. Our speakers will juxtapose the lives and works of two important figures in the course, Miguel Covarrubias, a Mexican-born caricaturist who spent most of his life in New York City, and Elizabeth Catlett, a US-born Black sculptor and printmaker who spent her life in Mexico. Covarrubias and Catlett captured students' imaginations in part because they serve as human bridges connecting the United States with Mexico, as well as the past with the present. Our panelists include Kay Heelan-Gaston, a lecturer on American religious history and ethics at Harvard Divinity School. She is the 2019 author of Imagining Judeo-Christian America, Religion, Secularism, and the Redefinition of Democracy. This talk is based on her fall 2020 course, Before Religious Pluralism, Religion, Race, Art, and Politics, which features the Whitney Museum's Vita Americana exhibit catalog as one of its main texts. Heelan is joined by Stephen Harris, an emerging scholar of American religion and a faith-based public policy expert. Currently a PhD student in the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard, Stephen's research interests lie at the historical intersection of Black religious thought and Calvinistic theology. Most recently, he has considered the theologics of historical Black religious actors in conversation with the contemporary discursive edges of critical race theory and Afro-pessimist thought. Without further ado, let's learn more about human bridges in the study of race, religion, art, and politics. Heelan, the virtual floor is yours. And while we're just sorting out our technical issues, we want to remind people that the Q&A will be open throughout this talk. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Thank you very much.
Greetings. My apologies. Our PowerPoint was not immediately cooperating, but now we are ready and going. All right. First of all, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. This is an exciting opportunity for me and for Stephen to talk some about a course that has really been dear to both of our hearts. It's been a really amazing semester, actually. And so it'll be fun to share some of what we've been doing with you. I also want to thank the Harvard Initiative for Learning and Teaching and the Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning, especially Cassie McGrath for making this event possible. This talk revolves around the course that Stephen and I taught this past semester at Harvard Divinity School, and we'll start by just laying out how the course came to be, and then I'll give an overview of the lives and works of two of the compelling figures we discussed, the Mexican-born caricaturist Covarrubias and the American-born artist-activist Catlett, and then talk about how their stories help dramatize some of the course's central themes. I'll conclude with a few words about the power of human bridges for teaching across boundaries. All right, so the course is called Before Religious Pluralism, Religion, Race, Art, and Politics, and it built outward from the many remarkable points of connection and cross-fertilization between the Harlem Renaissance and Mexican modernism during the 1920s and 30s. We're familiar with the many characters from the Harlem Renaissance, such as the philosopher Elaine Locke, the poet Langston Hughes, and the novelist Zora Neale Hurston, But many other artists and writers participated in this movement to redefine Blackness in positive terms after World War I. Mexican modernism is best known to American audiences through the works of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, who still retain their celebrity status. There are dense webs of connection between these two movements that are typically obscured by our conceptualization of them in purely national terms. As I'll explain, individuals such as Covarrubias and Catlett served as human bridges between the two sites, fostering these networks of movement, influence, and exchange. Because the course was a graduate-level research seminar, I asked the students to read both primary sources, including lots of images, of course, and scholarly analysis, along with various pieces of online commentary. This had the potential to be somewhat confusing, or even overwhelming, but I explained to them at the outset that the course was a puzzle to which we would add pieces from one week to the next, eventually creating a coherent picture. We did have something of a central text in the latter portions of the course as we started to pull all the pieces together, the catalog for the Whitney Museum's recent exhibit, Vida Americana, Mexican Muralists Remake American Art, 1925 to 1945. That book, like the other readings, captured the students' imaginations during a semester when our experiences have too often been diminished by quarantine and flattened by Zoom. Now, you may recall that the title of the course is Before Religious Pluralism, and the subtitle includes religion and politics as well as race and art. What are the connections here? The initial idea for this course grew out of my work on the relationship between democracy, pluralism, and secularism in the modern United States. I have degrees in both religious studies and United States history, and I work at the intersection of these fields, focusing especially on religion, politics, and ethics. And although I love art and have been a long-time connoisseur of art, I am not a specialist in art history. So there are limits to my knowledge in that area, but I've learned a great deal this semester, and I'm excited to share some of that with you and talk with you about what you know about these figures. In a number of publications, I have explored how the notion of the United States as in some sense a Judeo-Christian polity, defined by religious pluralism, became a central feature of American political culture in the mid-20th century. I look at key figures such as the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and the Jewish thinker Will Herberg, who helped to both promote religious pluralism and define it in Judeo-Christian terms during these years. Their work helped to foster what I call a redefinition of democracy in the World War II era, one that has circumscribed the boundaries of the politically possible in the United States right up to our own time, although I think we may be living through another period of redefinition. The imperative to defend democracy, first from Nazi aggression in the late 1930s and then from godless communism in the early 1950s, made religion central to American political discourse during the interwar period. The concept of religious pluralism often accompanied the claim that Christianity and Judaism stood in special relationship to the nation's public culture. I had taught a course called Judeo-Christian Culture Wars in the fall of 2019, and I knew that our students were curious to learn more about conceptions of democracy and pluralism before this redefinition took place in the 1940s and 50s. Before that period, though the term pluralism was not firmly connected to beliefs about the religious dimensions of national identity. In the 1920s and early 30s, the concept of cultural pluralism was more common. The term was most often associated with the philosopher Horace M. Callan, who wrote about religious, ethnic, and racial differences in the World War I era in the early 1920s. Callan was a secular Jewish thinker. He was a committed Zionist, but he defined Jewish identity in cultural rather than religious terms, and advocated a fully inclusive, formally secular public sphere. Of course, both of these ways of thinking emerged in response to vast demographic shifts occasioned by industrialization between roughly 1880 and 1920. The United States had been overwhelmingly Protestant through most of the 19th century, but it rapidly became much more diverse, religiously, ethnically, and racially. The concepts of religious pluralism and cultural pluralism focused on particular features of this new landscape. Religious pluralism highlighted religious identities while downplaying other axes of difference. Cultural pluralism underscored ethnicity and race, often conflating them, and downplayed religious identities that cut across those lines. And when I say that these terms did that work, I'm definitely not saying that it was a necessarily intentional thing on the part of the people who used them. But I do think that they had the effect of defining democracy in ways that we still see in our discussions about what democracy means in the present. So even so, the notion of cultural pluralism had its limitations with regard to race as well. It emerged in reaction to the melting pot image, as theorists such as Callan rejected the idea that immigrants would or should assimilate into a monolithic American culture. But like the melting pot and the 1950s notion of the US as a nation of immigrants, cultural pluralism still made the most sense in relation to white immigrants from Europe. It had less to say about Black Americans, including those who fled the South in search of factory work during the Great Migration of the 1910s to 1940s. Their experience of anti-Black discrimination at every turn, even in the North, gave the lie to both the melting pot metaphor and the hopeful promise of peaceful coexistence that the cultural pluralism framework offered. For that matter, there was still plenty of nativism directed at recent immigrants, most of whom lived in poverty and endured the unrelenting demands of factory work. But white ethnic immigrants were better off than their Black counterparts. Still, cultural pluralism opened up the possibility of talking about race in ways that the melting pot image had shut down. The first several weeks of the course focused on how various figures understood the relationship between cultural pluralism and race, from the mid-1910s to the 1930s. Calls for tolerance and goodwill toward new immigrants obviously intersected in key ways with debates among Black intellectuals such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois about how to achieve racial parity or empowerment. These debates entered a new phase after Du Bois's participation in the Pan-African Congress of 1918-1919, which emphasized the international dimensions of the Black struggle. The Harlem Renaissance also took shape, seeking new aesthetic forms and standards that could capture Black experience. One figure we discussed at length was the philosopher Alain Locke, who edited an important collection of essays called The New Negro in 1925, and thought about how to make cultural pluralism more racially inclusive. But within 15 years or so, in the era of World War II, the tenor of these debates in the US had shifted dramatically. As I mentioned, the imperative to defend democracy against fascism tended to shine a spotlight on religious identities rather than other axes of difference. In a 1938 quote from the influential Catholic historian Carlton J.H. Hayes, he basically illustrates this new approach. Hayes invoked cultural pluralism and called it a bulwark against totalitarianism, but he defined cultural pluralism and American democracy in terms of, quote, the traditional cultural differences among our several religious groups. In such formulations, culture came to be interchangeable with religion. And whereas Callan identified secularism as the guarantor of religious freedom, and thus true pluralism, Hayes portrayed secularism as the enemy of genuine pluralism. He charged that a secular state would fuse religious differences or, quote, blot them out altogether, destroying American democracy in the process. This was not the only meaning of the term religious pluralism, but it was an extremely influential one. As that term came into use in the 1940s and 50s, along with the closely associated Judeo-Christian discourse, it defined Americans as Protestants, Catholics, or Jews, not members of racial or ethnic groups. Even more than cultural pluralism, in fact, both religious pluralism and Judeo-Christian formulations tended to portray Americans as implicitly white. All right, so what I'm going to do at this juncture is to tell you a little bit about some of the characters that we have met this semester. And I should say, just to start out, that one of the things that is so important about the legacy of Carlton Hayes for the story that I'm telling you today is that he and Callan really were at loggerheads with one another about this question of the meaning of secularism. And both of them had conceptions of pluralism that were about trying to preserve the ability of groups to live robustly and in harmony with one another. But they each felt very differently about the role that secularism might play in bringing about such a reality or shutting down the possibility for such a reality. So I just want to make sure to emphasize that, because sometimes when we think about Callan as the author of cultural pluralism, it's easy to sort of see that in kind of more glowing terms and not recognize how contested the idea was in its own day. Now I'm going to move pretty quickly from this point just to make sure that we can stay on track. And then I'll come back to some reflections about the course as a whole and some of the themes that we've been working on this semester. All right, so we're going to start with Miguel Covarrubias. He was born in 1904 in Mexico City and died there in 1957. He was a self-trained illustrator, theater designer, printmaker, and anthropologist. He moved to New York City in 1923 with a three-person show that highlighted Mexican art. He painted caricatures for the leading periodicals of the day, and his works were collected in a 1925 volume called The Prince of Wales and Other Famous Americans. And I think when you see some of his work, you'll realize that you've probably seen some of it before, whether you knew who did it or not. So here are some pictures of Covarrubias. This first one from 1920, around the time that his exhibition brought him to New York, and he was a very young person then. I mean, really like barely out of his teen years. And then this is a picture of him from the Guggenheim Foundation, because he won a fellowship to do some of the anthropological and ethnographic work that he did in the 30s and 40s. Here are some wonderful examples of classic Covarrubias caricatures. The first here, a caricature of Clark Gable and Edward, Prince of Wales from 1932. And then the second, a caricature of Emily Post. And I think that it's important to recognize that there's a sort of wonderful kind of sense of humor and irony in much of what Covarrubias is doing. He's very interested in caricature as a mode of sort of a political critique, but also really as a form of just plain old fun. He has a sense that that the question of whether we can laugh at ourselves or we can laugh at the culture of celebrity, right, that's really the test of a person. And so he's partially out there playing with this question of how far can I go and trying to sort of puncture pretensions. And that's a very an interesting project, and one that we'll talk more about in the next section of this talk. All right, so Covarrubias basically is traveling during these years. He's in New York for most of the time from the 20s into the early 40s. And during that time, he intersects with various figures from the Harlem Renaissance. Now, the thing that's fascinating about him is that as a self-trained anthropologist and ethnographer, it might be the sort of thing where we're skeptical of his skills, but in fact, he became very widely recognized as having produced one of the most important books about Balinese culture that has been written, and so that's part of the reason why the Guggenheim eventually funded his work. But I want to start just by pointing out that he has a very sort of deep fascination with cultural traits and racial differences, and that led to a certain amount of controversy around his work. There were people like W.B. Du Bois who did not, who felt like it went too far often in this respect, and there were others, James Weldon Johnson, who really appreciated Covarrubias, and he had many, many personal contacts within the Harlem Renaissance, but the sort of sense of what he was doing was sometimes mixed among various different kinds of audiences that he was writing for and drawing for. So he does work that basically makes its way into all of the major figures of the Harlem Renaissance. Elaine Locke's The New Negro, Langston Hughes' The Weary Blues, Zora Neale Hurston's Mules and Men. And then he publishes this book about Bali in 1937, after having gone there on his honeymoon and fallen in love with the place. So we can see here the Weinrold Rees portrait of Langston Hughes. This is an incredible portrait, and Weinrold Rees was a fascinating character who also really bridges the Harlem Renaissance and Mexican modernism. He is moving between these locales a great deal during these years, and another sort of person who could have formed a human bridge here. And then this is the cover of Langston Hughes' The Weary Blues. And then here we have some of the Covarrubias work on Bali, the island of Bali, 1937, and this map of Bali. Covarrubias loved to make maps, and they're very engaging and entertaining. Some of them are solemn and sort of ethnographic in tone. Others of them are humorous, but they're quite fascinating. All right, and so in terms of Covarrubias' later work, he painted map murals for the Golden Gate exhibition in 1939. He returned to Mexico in the early 1940s, and during that time, he helped to recover Olmec culture and history. And his his drawings there are very sort of strongly anthropological, and he did just amazing sketches and voluminous numbers of them. And so I think just really the sort of thoroughness of his effort is one of the reasons why his anthropological and ethnographic work is so respected. Um, then he did various studies of the indigenous people of Mexico, a lot of attention to different styles of dress in different parts of the country. Published a book called Mexico South in 1946, and then a second, The Eagle and the Jaguar and the Serpent, in the 1950s. And this gives you a sense of the sort of difference in tone of some of the ethnographic work that Covarrubias did during these years. This is a pretty famous image from the 1946 book. And then here are some other depictions of Mexico. And I think for the purposes of our course, these are important because one of the things that that is crucial about crossing borders in this period in the 1920s and 30s between the US and Mexico is this question of how do you travel, right? Train travel, car travel, right? Do you travel by boat? Do you fly? So there's a moment here in the 20s and 30s where travel, and really earlier, frankly, using trains, where travel and exchange here is more easily facilitated for lots of people than it would be in farther distant places. And so, he's very much a part of a kind of growing tourist industry. He's starting to contribute to that with travel posters and maps that are both designed to educate and to pique curiosity. All right. So now I want to turn quickly to the work of Elizabeth Catlett. I wish we had more time to devote to each of these figures because they're so fascinating. It was a very hard task to figure out which slides to include, but I'm going to do my best to give you a good overview here. Born in 1915 in Washington, D.C., she died as a Mexican citizen in Cuernavaca, Mexico in 2012. Her father was a math teacher at the Tuskegee Institute and the child of formerly enslaved people. He earned a BS from Howard University in 1935 with a focus on drawing and printmaking, and she briefly worked as a muralist for the Federal Arts Project of the WPA in the mid-1930s. Catlett was the first Black woman to earn an MFA in sculpture at the University of Iowa in 1940. So here's a picture of her. She was sort of split her time equally between sculpting and printmaking, lithographs, and these are just pictures from sort of a little earlier on and a little later in her life with some of her works that give you a sense of what a sort of robust and engaging personality she was. So Catlett's early influences, she went to Howard after being turned away from the Carnegie Institute of Technology due to race. She'd gotten into the school, and then when they found out that she was African American, they told her she couldn't attend. Influenced by the art theories of Elaine Locke and James A. Porter and the activism of Mexican muralists such as Diego Rivera, right? So she's definitely in these currents. She's a little on the old side for really being quite in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance. And that's something that's really unique about Covarrubias because he comes to New York at such an early age. But she definitely is the person who sort of forms a bridge from the Harlem Renaissance to the Black arts movement of the 60s and 70s. She was advised by the American regionalist Grant Wood to focus on familiar subjects, namely, she said, for me, these are women, Black people, and workers. During the summers with her grandparents, she spent time with her grandparents in North Carolina, where she saw firsthand the plight of sharecroppers in the Jim Crow South. And any of you who are familiar with her work will know that she depicted these figures with great care. During the middle years, she and her husband, Charles White, were targeted by the FBI in the 1940s for radicalism and supporting interracial cooperation. They moved to Mexico City together to escape persecution. In 1946, she worked at the Taller de Gráfica Popular, and this was an important art collective, and that's where she met and married Francisco Mora. Her first show, Negro Woman, toured Southern Black women's colleges in 1947. Her work emphasized the shared experiences of Black and Mexican workers. And in 1962, she became a Mexican citizen and was barred from the US. But she definitely had firsthand experience of political persecution as a sort of radical artist during these years. All right, so here are some of the images that I think are sort of emblazoned in the minds of members of our class. These this image on the right, Catlett, War Worker, 1943, is just a remarkable image. It's one of the few that she actually, it's a tempera painting, and it was based on a lithograph that she did, one of the few paintings that she did. It's quite a small painting, but it just has that kind of intense kind of sculptural dimension. And it reminds, very reminiscent of Aaron Douglas's work in the way that she's playing with light and color and really getting into just all these like subtle tonal differences that really that just illuminate this particular piece. And then Catlett, the sharecropper image from 1947, that's a very, very famous print that many of you, I'm sure, have seen in different contexts at the MoMA and various other places. But these are, the kinds of works that are really just sort of signature Catlett. And I think for many people, these are the works that cause them to want to learn more about who is this amazing artist. All right. So in the context of the Black arts movement, Elizabeth Catlett portrayed Black power figures as well as mainstream Black leaders. She sculpted an important sculpture in 1968 called Homage to My Young Black Sisters, and lithographed Black is Beautiful in the same year. She had a prominent feature article in Ebony in January of 1970, and major New York exhibitions in 1993, 1998. She was working into her 90s. Her U.S. citizenship was reinstated in 2002, and I think we have at least a couple of pieces of hers from the 2000s in the slides to come. So she had a remarkable, long, and fascinating life that I'm excited to learn more about. And I think I'm speaking for other members of our class when I say that that's true for them too. All right, so here are some of the most riveting images from the Black arts movement. This Malcolm X Speaks for Us is a canonical piece that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Catlett's Harriet from 1975 is also just a remarkable piece. She did a series of historical pieces, and there's a wonderful essay about them that we read in the class. Unfortunately, there are way too many figures to include here, but I would encourage you to look in particular to the way that she is, now no longer a U.S. citizen, but using this history to try to make social change, right, from Mexico. All right. So now I want to take a moment after that painfully short overview of these two fascinating people to say a little bit to you about some of the major themes from this course. And, I've got them listed here, but I'll talk about each of them individually in relation to some of the pieces of art by these two figures. All right. So the first is this question of the particular amid the universal, right? And one of the things that we discovered very soon is just that a lot of what the modernists, the Mexican modernists, are grappling with, especially, is this question of what it is that we see when someone is going about their daily activities, like what it is that takes something that looks daily and turns it into something that others can relate to in such a way that it feels universal, right? And so we came back again and again to the idea that these various art pieces, right, have this theme of the relationship between the particular and the universal and the way in which they tend to collapse into one another, right? So they're either coming to the image like through a sort of sense that it's speaking to something universal and then seeing the particular, or coming in through seeing the particular and then thinking about how it connects to the universal. And one of the reasons why this is such an important theme presently is that people are thinking very critically about terms like the universal, the human, humanization. Like, what does that mean, right? And, whose kinds of experiences does it hold up as normative, and whose experiences does it, classify as not human, right? And so, I think these are some interesting images because they give you different snapshots, right, from different periods about how the universal and the human and the particular are all kind of coming together in some of this artwork. So, for instance, with the Catlett learning piece from 1948, the assumption that learning is done in books, right? That's a huge assumption, especially if you come from a culture where traditions are oral. Catlett, the family, right? The sort of, portrayal here is, raises real questions about sort of the heteronormative notion of the family, right? And then here, this is a fascinating piece, Catlett, "My right is a future of equality with other Americans," right? A piece that was done for her show, her first show in 1947, but not actually inked until 1989, right? And that image is just, I think, symbolic of the fact that questions about the universal and the questions about what equality means, right, and for whom, right, are constantly changing in relation to context, right? So that was something we talked a fair amount about. A second thing that came up throughout the course was what I would just call the sort of the challenges that go with characterization, right? So someone like Miguel Covarrubias, right, he is, doing ethnographic work. He's very careful. He's very observant. He's doing wonderful drawings, and he's doing a lot of describing of the things that he sees around him, right? But the process of describing others can very soon become the process of essentializing others. And before long, coming to the sense that there are essential characteristics that you would associate with groups or individuals can become downright stereotyping of others. And so one of the reasons why Covarrubias's work is complicated for lots of viewers is that he's trying to pick up on some of these ins and outs. And this is, I think it's a problem that goes even down to the level of the question that W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington are debating about the talented tenth, and like approaches to, the question of, in their age, they called it racial uplift, but the point of the conversation was really about this question of how are we going to move in the direction of greater equality? I think with Covarrubias's caricatures, you could see how someone like W.E.B. Du Bois would have potentially found this hard to understand, or really to understand in a way that seemed productive, right? That it would have been undignified, and that it would have actually constrained the range of Black identity by trying too hard to understand it from a vantage point that didn't give it sort of the range of multiplicity that it deserves. Right, so these are the sorts of issues that we were talking about in this class, and these images obviously are very striking on this score as having essentializing and sort of stereotyping potential. Okay, so here's a third theme that came up in the course that we talked about a great deal, which is this question of how humor plays a role in negotiating difference. So in the original slide, I said that humor is kind of a double-edged sword, right? And if you think about this, it's definitely the case that laughter can kind of cut two ways. Covarrubias has given us a couple of caricatures that are great for the holidays here. The first is Admirable Bird, right, celebrating Christmas alone at a pole in 1934 with his little tree, right, over to the side. And then this is one of the many Covarrubias like hand-drawn cards, holiday cards that he would send to friends and associates. And if you can look closely, he's drawn his front teeth as fangs, but interestingly, someone pointed out that he generally, most of his life was quite portly. And so even though he gave himself fangs, he like managed to sort of trim himself down. So he was looking quite svelte, right? In the hand-drawn Christmas card here. But I think the thing that we, sort of came away from the course talking some about is the fact that laughter can be an equalizer, right? It can be something that encourages people to connect, to laugh at themselves, right? To get to a sort of greater degree of intimacy with one another, to interrogate their own assumptions. But it can also be very hurtful, and can actually, participate in sort of forms of exclusion and violence in social groups. An example of this, which I actually decided not to show because it's really quite a racist image, is an image that Covarrubias drew for Fortune magazine in 1942. And it was about the Japanese, and it's a pretty famous image, so some of you may have seen it, but it essentially, he writes down at the bottom, it's certainly not the case that all Japanese people are stereotypically this way, but then he proceeds to sort of unfurl 8 different kind of caricatured drawings of the different stereotypes of Japanese people in the period. And this is something that is a source that was recently foregrounded in a book by Julian Thomas, that has just won the AAR's Book Award for 2020. It's one of the many fascinating sources in that book, but I was really interested to see it there because it definitely dramatizes in the context of the Second World War, how transgressive caricature can be, and like how touchy and outright, in this case I think it's really a racist image. I mean, Julian, he does not put it on posters, he doesn't circulate it, and I'm following his lead there because I think that it is really quite striking how Covarrubias himself is talking about the danger of stereotype and yet pushes forward. And so that's a real difference in the way that we think about what caricature means, in this period versus our own day. All right, a fourth thing that we talked about in the context of the course a great deal was the role of political art in consciousness raising, and the question of, art as a tool for attacking structural inequality. And I guess the question that circulated a great deal during this period is just, what is it about images? What is it about these sculptures? What is it about the power of art that makes it capable of changing what we think we know about the world around us? And there's no question that images are just incredibly strong in our visual sense. And for some reason, I think it's the case that there were, lots of people in our course who said, gosh, I'll never forget this image. Or there's something about the way this image moves me intellectually and emotionally. It's the combination of the intellectual and the emotional. I really think that's some of it. This wonderful Catlett piece from 1946, I have special reservations. Right? She had a serious sense of humor too, although her work tends to be more somber, more serious in tone, a little more serious in tone than Covarrubias is. But she's witty and not afraid to say exactly what she thinks about things, and it's really incredible, just the ferocity of that commitment in her work. 1968, we've got Black Unity, and this is the sculpture that I mentioned before, Homage to My Young Black Sisters. All right, this image is the war worker that we saw before, and I've juxtaposed it with a very troubling image. This was actually in the Vita Americana catalog, and I included it here because I think that in our own conversations, these two images may have been the most powerful images that we encountered in the Vita Americana. And it is precisely the fact that Catlett manages in her work to do such humanizing things, right, with the war worker, just the intricacy and the beauty of this image. Right? She's got tremendous skills in that way. And then the stark contrast, right, between this image and the image of a person who has been trampled down, lies at the feet of others, lynched, right, lower than a snake's belly, right? And so there's something just incredibly gripping about the way that Catlett manages in her work to capture humanization and dehumanization. And again, because of the ways in which we are interrogating the idea of the human that comes, very strongly through in human rights in this period, right? And that has universalizing tendencies and helps us think sometimes in ways that are actually more constrained than we realize. That's one of the reasons then why we were sort of debating about this question of, well, how would we describe this intensity in Catlett's work? Can we do it without terms like humanization and dehumanization? And if so, what are those terms? All right. The other theme in Catlett's work, and this is something that came through again and again, and it was related to one of the primary objectives of the course, which was to get a better sense of where religion factored into Mexican modernism and in the Harlem Renaissance and in the Black arts movement. And so themes around suffering and redemption. You see these very strongly in the historical prints that I mentioned before, of which the Harriet Tubman image is one of many. But this one, I think, fits in important ways with the last image of lynching, just because you can see in the background the woman, she's playing her songs and she's using her art, her guitar, she's making sense of this incredibly troubled past, right? And giving the gift of her songs to the world, right? With that past just right over her shoulder. And then this beautiful piece from the same period, Catlett, my reward has been bars between me and the rest of the land, right? And these images are just incredible. And they're pretty unforgettable. In fact, I think the number of people that I've spoken with who say, "Oh, I realized that one of my favorite images was done by Catlett, but I never knew who did it." That's something that has been a running theme for us as we've grappled with this work. All right, and then the last thing that I want to put on the table that was crucial for us this semester was just to talk about the commodification of culture. When do we know when cultural exchange is happening, and when do forces of commodification come into the picture? There was a recent book talk at the Harvard bookstore by a young woman, Ariana Davis, who has written this book, What Would Frida Do? A Guide to Living Boldly. And we spent a good bit of time in particular talking about the case of Frida and the sort of commodification of Frida's image and the sort of Frida mania that has cropped up at different times in US history. And really world history. There was a period in the 90s, but now there seems to be a lot of Frida mania going around again. And so trying to understand sort of how that works and what it tells us in the present moment has been a source of real interest to our students as we neared the end of the semester. All right, and so here are a few resources for anyone who has curiosity has been piqued and might want to learn more. There's a wonderful website devoted to the work of Elizabeth Catlett. Material on Miguel Covarrubias is a little harder to find, but not impossible. And I would highly recommend the Vita Americana exhibit and the actual exhibit at the Whitney. And I just want to say in closing a couple of words about my sort of pedagogical aims in this course. I think it's easy to forget that learning can be a frightening experience, even for highly accomplished students at a place like Harvard. The specter of not knowing, of being outpaced by peers, or being judged by teachers, can undermine our students' confidence in both themselves and the institution. Such fears are completely normal in learning environments, but if left unaddressed, they can fatally compromise the spirit of openness and willingness to take risks that deep learning requires. For me, this is where human bridges come in. If you can convince students to care about a particular historical actor, and to see their dilemmas as knowable, shared, and relevant, then you can build on that foundation and teach them almost anything. But if historical figures remain mere items to be memorized, abstract objects of knowledge that the student must master, the fear of judgment or the threat of failure can stand in the way of learning. In this case, when students come to see figures like Covarrubias and Catlett as their own conversation partners, even friends, right? They suddenly gain access to the historical process of transnational border crossing a century ago. Suddenly, they understand the personal stakes. Teaching through such figures helps students inhabit past thought worlds, and using individuals who served as human bridges can help them help them move more gracefully across national boundaries and between cultural movements, as well as across time. I'm looking forward to developing this pedagogical technique more fully in future courses, and I'd be very glad for your suggestions on how to implement and improve it. Most of all, I appreciate your time and attention today and look forward to our conversation.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. And maybe we can unshare your slides so we can take a look, be able to sort of speak face to face. As we think particularly about this question of learning and teaching, so let's start with the human bridges notion. Do you feel, this is the question we're getting, do you feel that human bridges are particularly likely to come at particular times in history that make them particularly effective? Or they're always human bridges? You could just pluck out any era or decade and there are human bridges to be found.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think there are always human bridges between the past and the present. I'm very committed to the idea that the past remains strangely and in ways sometimes that are hard to predict alive in the present, which doesn't mean that it determines the present. I'm not one of these folks who thinks that we need to be, overly concerned about the past. I just think that there's a kind of synergism between the past and the present that is remarkably powerful. And in my own work on Judeo-Christian discourse, I have really come to see that um, oftentimes in our political culture, there's a sort of sense of history repeating itself, but with slightly different terms. So a sort of circular quality, right, of our historical engagement. And I've often wondered if that has to do with the fact of just how ideas and concepts and experiences move down the generations and how processes of definition happen across generations, right? So sort of a certain kind of predictableness in the way that ideas and certain memories are passed on. So yeah, I guess I would say that I do think there's a certain continuity there, but I also think that we're living in a moment where, I mean, for my students, there's a sort of sense of urgency about the question of what comes next. And since in my own work I had, already sort of theorized the idea that we were living inside of a political paradigm that was really made in the context of the Second World War, then it made total sense that my students seemed fascinated by the, well, what was before that question. And so one of the reasons why we came back to this period is that it speaks to what, helping us think outside the box about politics and culture and identity and art, right? I mean, it really has, I think, had that effect for them. So I would say there is a certain kind of resonance here that's unique.
So, Stephen, let me ask you to pick up on this. But do you feel that that we are at a particular moment in which looking back at human bridges is especially resonant? Or again, could we have done this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and it would still be just as timeless or just as specific to its time?
Well, I think there is a significance to the lens of retrospection, right? We're looking back on these things, we highlight these things as kind of students of eras that have gone by. And one of the things that was, I think, a draw of this course for students was that kind of internationalist hemispheric frame that the course intentionally took. Said, look, these writers and thinkers that we often think in these kind of boundaried and bounded ways, whether it's the Harlem Renaissance in the United States or the muralist movement coming on the heels of the Mexican Revolution in Mexico as kind of like their own national projects, but to see the ways in which, as Professor Gaston pointed out, these relationships these linkages were taking place, and people thought about their own projects of whether it is uplift or identity or modernity in conversation. I think seeing those historical moments, I think trains us in that kind of lens to always be looking for the linkages that might exist in our current moment. And we've seen this in our present day with just something like the Black Lives Matter movement becoming literally a global discourse on race, on coloniality, on all of these things that are part of our conversation. Those linkages, that lens, I think, has become a kind of democratized lens, and people have no problem taking it up. But you see these things more acutely in retrospection, right? And I think that's one of the projects of this course, to kind of get students familiar with taking that kind of hemispheric or internationalist frame.
Well, of course, that's a particular question a time when for many, it seems hard to be internationalist. It seems hard to get outside of one's own head or biases. Maybe this is a moment to ask, given that we're convening this signature event in the context of the recent HILT conference on championing equitable instruction and inclusive classrooms, maybe I could ask Mr. Gaston to talk first. How did you go about addressing sensitive images, right? You've talked about, you have images in the course that were overtly racist. There's certainly others that are provocative deliberately on questions of race and questions of violence. How did you choose to address those, and what kind of comfortable or uncomfortable conversation did they produce?
Well, that's a great question. I think that since this is a course that I was teaching for the first time, I sort of followed the guidance of the Vita Americana, for instance. I paid attention to how they were handling sensitive issues and images, and tried as much as I could to respect the boundaries that they're carving out. I don't think that those are the only boundaries that we can observe in a classroom setting. But I do think that, it's easy if you have rapport in a class to not remember how quickly images with this kind of power and weight behind them can wreck that sort of dynamic, right? And so, I think that, we went out of our way with, for instance, Covarrubias's work to, really let people know this is something that you will see. Like if you go on the internet and go looking at the sort of range of his work, you will see some images that you will really recoil from. I mean, that you will find disturbing. Some of that is the sort of Art Deco quality. I mean, we were talking at one point about how, some of his pictures from Bali, like all have this sort of strange, like almost pinup quality about them. So there's certain sorts of artistic sensibilities from that period that are really kind of hard to get your brain around. But it doesn't, I think, change the fact, it doesn't undermine, like the fact that it's historically meant in some particular way or sits inside of an historical context doesn't undermine our reaction to those images, right? I mean, if those images are going to continue to be relevant and things that we should talk about and reassess, then we also have to sort of respect the integrity of our own responses from this present day time to these images. So a lot of what we would talk about is we would say, well, how does this image strike you? I think, this is a good example. Like when you have artistic sources or you have sources that can be read very differently by different people in a classroom setting, it's really good to just have open-ended questions. It's like, how did this image strike you? Like, what did you notice about it? Like, what kinds of feelings did it elicit? And then you can move on from there to, talk about some of the differences in the way that people apprehended the image, or talk about some of the ways that other people in history have talked about the image. I mean, you can historicize it. You can look at contemporary voices. I'd say the biggest thing that we did was we tried to look at a lot of different voices, right, on some of these questions, because the real goal of the course, right, is to give students through this case study, this particular juxtaposition, a set of tools for thinking about where we go from here. And on that score, I don't have a sense of any kind of clear patterns at this acrimonious moment in this country's history and in world history, right, about what is likely to happen. But I definitely think that the redefinition of democracy had this way of sort of bounding our language about politics, our political culture, right? And in the last two presidencies, we've seen like real sort of serious departure from very long-standing traditions that kind of, go from the 40s all the way up in terms of the way that people handle political rhetoric and talk about questions of identity and any number of other things. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I see a paradigm shift beginning. Whether that paradigm shift, takes 20 years or 40 years, I don't know. And what comes after it, I don't know. But all of the demographic, evidence that we have points in the direction that, that we are not thinking about politics quite the same way. And a lot of it has to do with younger people becoming older and becoming voters and coming in with their own ideas about how they want to define these questions. And that is something that happens with every generation.
Stephen, maybe you can pick up on the point. I mean, you do some public policy work as well as your own historical study. So do you see a paradigm shift? Do you think that the images we're talking about should be taught, I'll use the term ahistorically, that is to say, contextualized for people by their current experience? Or should they be contextualized that that was what people thought at that time because they lived differently then?
Well, no, Professor Gaston, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, you go for it, Stephen.
I think it is important to always try to understand things in context. I think that's important to get a sense of as we're studying artists and their particular lived experiences and the times in which they lived and what their work meant for them and what it meant for the moment. But I think it is going to always be a kind of presentist concern. And we talked about this in the course. What does it mean to take an image and put a representation of it up in a Whitney museum that is totally kind of distinct and divorced from where it was originally placed and what it originally, the kind of affect it originally had, right? I think those will be kind of dual concerns that are always going to run parallel. But I think as much as you can get that kind of historical context, it at least, I think, informs the ways in which you might process your own response in your own location, in your own context, to that current representation of whatever that image is or whatever that piece of art is. And so I'm always going to be an advocate for both of those things as shaping one's kind of full response to a particular image or a text in a moment.
Excellent. Did you want to respond there?
I just think that, much as humor, I mean, you know when a joke lands or when it doesn't, in the same way you know when an image captures your imagination. And sometimes it's not because of something that you find about it that's pleasant. I mean, sometimes it's the force of it or the way in which it's troubling or the way in which it points out something to you that you had never thought about before or forces you to look at yourself in a new way. I guess I would say that I do think that with images, particularly images depicting violence, that we have to be really careful about, sharing them in contexts that can be re-traumatizing. And so we try to do the best we can to sort of set some guidelines for that in the classroom setting. But I also think that, that I think keeping the doors, keeping communication open around the sorts of encounters that people are having, like with one another, right? And with these powerful works, that's a big part of it. That's a really big part of it. And it's, it makes a difference to students just to know that they can reach out to one of us. And we will say that, we'll say, hey, there's, some really intense stuff on the table today. We just want to remind you that we're around if you feel like you want to reach out. And sometimes students do, but not all that often. So, I hope that it's something that we're handling well, but it's definitely a tricky question, and one that every exhibition faces, every institution faces, like every individual instructor faces, and people sort of draw those lines a little differently. But I felt like we had some good guidance from the Vita Americana and several other museums that had figured out interesting and thought-provoking but careful ways to handle some of these images.
And really quickly, a species of our current moment, certainly the ways in which information, whether it be images, art, etc., is disseminated, the public platform, social media, and the ways in which these things then become taken up in current conversations, whether they be about politics or public policy, right? An image being passed around becomes then a site of public policy conversation in ways that perhaps couldn't have been possible or wasn't possible we didn't see several decades ago, right? So these things then become linked in very distinct ways to very present conversations about how we order ourselves societally. It's been fascinating to see the ways in which the dissemination via social media or again, other kind of hyper technologies will then tether us to these kind of politicized conversations that literally shape the ways in which we live in communities, right? So these things are all interrelated.
Fantastic. Well, this is, let me give you one more piece for context. This is unfortunately our last question. Where can people go see this art? For those who are in New York City, for example, where can they see these art? Where can they see the images that are, you're saying, have such power? Where should people go now?
Well, I mean, the Whitney Museum is a wonderful place to go to engage these images. I mean, I personally have really enjoyed, and everyone in the class bought a copy of the Vita Americana catalog. And, one of the nice things about it is that during the semester, we had periods of time where we would read large sections of it, but then we also, occasionally would return to it. And so it became something of a kind of point of return for us in thinking about these images. And it was very interesting, I think, for the students to realize that their own knowledge was expanding, and that as it expanded and as they started to understand the historical context more deeply or the stakes of this art more deeply, they would come back to images that they thought they had understood the sort of full, weight of, and see new things. So I actually am almost, in Zoom, trying, of course, like all of us, to make the best of it. But one of the things that's come out of it for us actually has been the sort of richness of being able to actually have these images at your disposal in a book form, where you can curl up with a warm cup of tea and sort of think through these things on your own time. Also, Zoom can be a really interesting way to talk with others about something that you share in common. But yes, the Whitney Museum, actually part of the Freedomania is that there have been huge numbers of exhibits that deal with Mexican modernism over the last 3 or 4 years. And so I would encourage people to look for a wide range of opportunities online to check out some of those exhibits. And then also the Elizabeth Catlett website that I mentioned there at the end is a remarkable resource for anyone who wants to learn more.
Fantastic. Stephen, where else should be people going, either physically or online? Where do they see the art? Where do they get the effect?
Yeah, one of the things that I've encouraged students to do this semester, who we had a few who had not been introduced to works from artists of the New Negro movement, or what we call the Harlem Renaissance, is to just investigate the particular artists themselves. Aaron Douglas, whether it be looking at Elaine Locke's work, to just search these individuals using the tools of research that are at their disposal. There have been a number of works, singular monographic volumes written about these individual contributors to this broader movement. The same would be true of the muralist movement in Mexico, whether it's Diego Rivera or Orozco or other artists of that period, to really be a researcher and see the ways in which these individual contributors contributed to this. They were kind of one blossom of the broader bloom of identity formation and reconceptions of nationalist identity in the 20th century. So to do individual searches of these artists and what they contributed to the broader moment.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sorry we don't have more time, but thank you so much, Helen and Stephen. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We'll hope you join us for future signature events. Information about upcoming events, as well as recordings of past signature events, can be found at socializeremotely.harvard.edu. Goodbye, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.